Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. We'll get started in just a minute. All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kira Zeidelman. I'm a senior manager in NARUC's Center for Partnerships and Innovation, and my colleague is also here, Charles.
Hi, Charles Harper, also at NARUC Center for Partnerships and Innovation.
And would like to welcome everyone to this webinar on changing coal operations and current compensation practices. I'll now pass things over to Chairman Kara Fornstrom with the Wyoming Public Service Commission.
Thanks, Kira and Charles. Welcome, everyone, to this webinar on the recent changes to U.S. coal plant operations and current compensation practices completed by Energy Ventures Analysis. For those of you who don't know me, as Kira said, Kara Fornstrom, I'm the chairman of the Wyoming Public Service Commission, and I also serve as vice chair of the Clean Coal Subcommittee through NARUC. And we have a couple of goals. We're a very active subcommittee, thanks to the great support of NARUC and efforts of Kira and Charles, to produce white papers on issues that we think are important related to our subject matter. And we also offer a couple of site visits every year for commissioners and staff to get out on the ground and see what's actually happening around the country. And I'll be talking about our upcoming site visit, which is a little different than our traditional practice, at the end of the webinar. Today we are joined by Philip Grader to discuss the results that they found through their analysis. I want to personally thank Philip for the opportunity to review the draft and provide comments and feedback in making this a great paper. I think you'll all find this presentation very interesting and informative. The results of the study are really quite significant. So I look forward to the presentation today and all of your questions following. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Fornstrom, and thank you, Kira and Charles, for again organizing this entire effort to put this white paper together and organizing this webinar. My name is Philip Grader. I'm a manager at Energy Ventures Analysis, overseeing the coal and environmental markets, and I'm the lead author of this white paper. For everyone on the call who's not familiar with our company, Energy Ventures Analysis is a consulting firm located in the Washington, D.C. metro area. For now, almost 40 years, we've been producing supply, demand, and price forecasts for the entire North American energy sector and for the major commodities, including coal, natural gas, power, renewables, and emission allowances. And besides our subscription offerings that really cover the entire energy sector in North America and also globally, we're also heavily engaged in individual consulting projects and research papers like this one for state and federal regulators, but also other regulated and deregulated power or electric power utilities, natural gas utilities, and essentially all other stakeholders in the energy space. For this particular paper, or for this particular webinar, the outline I'll talk briefly about the purpose of this study, and then really deep dive into some of these results that we've found while putting together this report, and just conclude with some major takeaways, and then we'll open it up for questions for the audience, what you might want to know further. So without further ado, for the study purpose, again, I think as everyone on the call is aware of, the U.S. energy markets or electricity sector has gone through some very significant changes over the last decade. Based on our latest projections, it looks like 2019 will be the lowest coal consumption year since 1979, and that number is not slowing down anytime soon from the recent coal retirements that we've heard. Again, the result of that, or the reasons for this decline, are the low natural gas prices, as a result of the shale gas revolution, and also very substantial reductions in the construction costs and operating costs for renewable energy sources like wind and solar. And so being aware of these changes in the sector, the NARUC has reached out and wanted to further investigate how these changes have impacted the operations of coal-fired power plants in the United States, and what current compensation practices exist to really appropriately compensate these coal plants for their changes in operations. Going into the results of this paper, again on the high level, as I said, the energy sector has gone through a significant change and a shift away from coal-fired generation to natural gas and renewable generation. As you can see here in the chart shows the overall U.S. energy generation mix by fuel type. As you can see, in 2008, coal generation made up more than 50% of the total electricity generation in the United States. In 2018, that share of coal generation has fallen to 28%. And based on our latest estimate for 2019, that share will be below 25%. The biggest increase we've seen over the last 10 years has come from natural gas generation. As you can see, it's grown from 21% to 35% and even more now in 2019. And also renewable, non-hydro renewable generation has seen some significant growth. Again, wind from just about 1% in 2008 to 7% and more at the end of this decade. And again, low natural gas prices and the substantial reduction in construction costs for renewables are the major drivers behind that shift in generation. Now, when looking on a state level, the replacement for coal largely depends on the available resources. Charles, next slide, please. Now, again, the replacement fuel for coal largely depends on the available resources in those particular states. The chart below shows the change in generation mix percentage for the different fuels by state between 2008 and 2018. So to read this chart, for example, in Georgia, coal generation fell from 64% in 2008 to 25% in 2018, which equals a reduction of 39%, as you can see here in the chart. Conversely, natural gas increased from 10% to 42% between 2008 and 2018, making a change in 32%. So as you can see on this chart, it's very obvious that in states that have access to cheap natural gas resources, for example, in the Marcellus region, like states in Ohio, have mostly replaced their coal generation with new natural gas generation or increased generation from existing natural gas facilities. Whereas states that have very high wind resources, like Iowa, like Kansas, like Oklahoma, have mostly replaced their falling coal generation with increased generation from wind resources. Now, to deep dive into how coal plant operations have changed between 2008 and 2018, we have analyzed the hourly continuous emission system monitoring data that these coal-fired power plants have reported to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. This data is also called the SEMS data. And we've looked at the data sets for 2008 and 2018. And the hourly generation data set for 2008 includes over 8.1 million observations for the 927 coal-fired electric generating units that were operable in 2008, and over 4.7 million observations in 2018 for the then 531 operable electric generating units. We chose 2008 as a base year because looking at the utilization rates for coal-fired power plants, that was one of the last years with very high utilization rates before these capacity factors have been declining. And when we looked at these operating changes, we looked at three major key factors here. One is the gross capacity factor, and we grouped it by operating segment. Second, we looked at the number of starts that these units had and grouped them into the various durations or the length of these starts, of these outages, and also looked at how long these units have been offline. And third, we looked at hourly ramping rates or changes in electric load or gross load for these units. First, and I think as most people are aware when looking at the coal generation over the last decade, capacity factors have fallen significantly for the U.S. coal fleet as a whole. Now, looking at it specifically for the average coal unit and the change from 2008 to 2018, this chart looks at the histogram or the distribution of hours by operating or utilization segment. So as you can see in gray, or the gray bars depict the histogram for the hours in 2008 for the average coal unit, and the blue bars for 2018. As you can see in 2008, 55% of the operating hours for the average coal unit, that coal unit operated at capacity factors or utilization rates greater than 80%. 80% is generally for the average coal units deemed the optimal utilization rate, meaning that's when the fuel efficiency for these units are at its optimum level. Operating below 80% will decrease the overall fuel efficiency or efficiency of that unit down to the maximum turndown level for these units. That's around 40 to 50% depending on the unit. Now, as you can see, that change or that distribution of hours changed significantly between 2008 and 2018, when in 2018 these units, or the average coal unit, only operate 37% of the time in this at these optimal capacity levels, and was offline almost the same amount of time. You can also see in the middle, for the middle capacity levels here in the 40 to 60%, we saw an increase, which indicates that these coal units are operating more and more at their maximum turndown levels and not at their optimal thermal efficiency levels. Next, when we also looked at the number and duration of outages that these coal plants have been online. Again, generally, the industry categorizes these outages by the number of hours in between, or the number of hours that this unit has been offline. And here we're talking about hot starts, refer to any outages less than 12 hours, warm starts, generally 12 to 48 hours, cold starts, 48 to 120 hours, and beyond. The reason why it's referring to the temperatures, it refers to the ambient temperatures in the boiler. And in general, the colder the ambient air temperature in the boiler, the greater the stress on the equipment and the less efficient, or the more fuel is used to bring up the temperature in the boiler during electric generation hours. So what we found was, even though the number of starts has declined slightly between 2008 and 2018, when in 2008 the average coal unit had about 12.5 starts in 2008, and that number declined to about 10.5 in 2018. What increased significantly was the time between these starts. Again, the average outage length in 2008 was just about 148 hours, which equals roughly 6 days. and that increased to 342 hours, or approximately 14 days in 2018. Again, as I said, the more time passes between starts, the lower the temperature in the boiler, and the greater the stress and maintenance costs to operate that coal unit. Next, we've looked at the coal plant ramping rates, or hourly generation changes. Again, to specify here, we looked at hourly SEMS data. So here, the percentage change is referring to the change in electric load or gross load for a particular boiler from 1 hour to the next. In general, for the entire country, we have found that there has not been a significant change between 2008 to 2018 for the country as a whole. However, this is due to a balancing fact for various states. We found that in states that had a very high increase in wind generation, like the state of Oklahoma, as I've shown earlier, where wind generation displaced coal generation between 2008 and 2018. These load changes from 1 hour to the other have changed significantly. In 2008, the coal units went online were either not ramping at all, which means they stayed at the same output level 30% of the time, or varied their output level by less than 2.5% from 1 hour to the next 56% of the time, and had greater changes in load, greater than 2.5% changes in load, only 13% of the time. In 2018, when we had a significant larger amount of wind generation on the electric grid in Oklahoma, that profile changed significantly, where now coal units are ramping up and down or changing their load from 1 hour to the next at levels greater than 2.5%, 42% of the time, or almost half the time, they're ramping at very high rates. Now, this is, again, due because of the variability of wind generation and with a lack of natural gas generation, new and existing in Oklahoma, to balance this wind generation. Coal units are now used to balance the grid in hours when wind generation drops significantly from 1 hour to the next. In states like Ohio, again, there's an example that I showed earlier where coal generation was mostly replaced by new or existing natural gas generation. That change worked the opposite, in the sense that coal generators in Ohio now are actually ramping at less extreme levels than they did in 2008. Again, when online, these coal units in Ohio are now not ramping 37% of the time, and only 22% of the time at levels greater than 2.5%, while the change, or the small change in load, less than 2.5%, was roughly the same. Again, this is due, overall, coal units in Ohio are offline for longer periods of time, as already discussed. But when they are online, they are brought online at either their maximum turn on level or at their optimal generation levels, and providing base load generation, while the existing or new natural gas generation in the state are then providing the load following, or the stabilization of the grid to balance supply and demand in the state of Ohio. Next. Now, this is an example where all of these three factors that we just discussed, we're showing in a real-life example. Again, here the chart shows the gross hourly generation profile of Xcel Energy's Harrington 1 coal unit in Texas. Harrington is located in the part of Texas that actually dispatches into the Southwest Power Pool, or also called SPP. And this hourly generation profile is for the month of December in 2008, shown in the red line, and in 2018, shown in the blue line. As you can see, it's very obvious that in 2008, Harrington 1 operated at its maximum generation level of about 350, 360 megawatts almost all of the time, and only turned down for a few hours over that month. However, in 2018, that generation profile changed significantly. As you can see, generation reached zero. It's about 5 times over the course of December 2018, and overall it looks the generation Harrington 1 operated mostly at its maximum turn down level and increased its generation when it's needed at times when wind generation fluctuated significantly or we had significant changes in load. Overall, in summary, to tie it back to the 3 factors that we just discussed, in 2008, Harrington 1's capacity factor for December was about 95%. It had 0 number of starts, and its average ramp rate was just about 1%. In 2018, on the other hand, that capacity factor dropped to just 57%. The number of starts increased to 5, and its average ramp rates increased also to 5%. And Harrington 1 is only one example of many coal plants that have gone through very similar changes in the United States. Now, why is this important? Again, in states where we had a significant increase in renewable generation, and we have seen a very low build of new natural gas generation, coal plants are now becoming more and more important to balance the grid and to balance the fluctuation in renewable energy generation. The chart here below shows the percent that the percent of the SPP generation mix that came from wind resources. As you can see, in 2011, wind generation reached as high as about 18% of SPP's total generation in a particular hour. That share has increased to over 60% in 2018 and has grown even more in 2019. Again, but as you can also see, the wind generation share can also drop to 0, and sometimes these changes in wind generation happen within just a few hours, and it falls on flexible generation or dispatchable generation like coal, like natural gas, and now emerging technologies like battery storage to really balance the grid and balance the fluctuation in renewable generation. Now, talking about the cost implications of the coal plant cycling, again, as already discussed earlier, when talking about the various starts, more starts and the higher fluctuation in gross generating output from these coal units increase the wear and tear on these high pressure and high temperature plant components. It shortens the periods between maintenance outages and will also increase the outages since more equipment will need to be replaced and repaired. Besides the decreased thermal efficiency at these maximum turn down levels, we also have increased fuel costs and lower fuel efficiency due to these starts and also these lower operating levels below the optimal capacity levels that we discussed earlier. Besides that, we also have negative impacts on emission control equipment and the FGD, and also in the NOx control equipment like the selective catalytic reduction equipment. And cost estimates, again, these are based on various studies that have been done on the cost of coal plant cycling. The average hot, warm, and cold start costs can range from $200 a megawatt to up to $400 a megawatt. and load falling, depending on the unit, averages at about $30 from optimal or from maximum generating levels down to the maximum turn down levels. Now, showing this the same example for Harrington Unit 1 that we just looked at, and now looking at just the energy revenue that it had generated in December of 2008 and 2018. Again, when looking at using its gross hourly generating output and using hourly regional power prices. Using hourly regional power prices and its hourly generating profile, we estimated the energy revenue that Harrington Unit 1 created in December 2008 and 2018. You can see on the red line, when Harrington operated at its maximum output levels at about 350, 360 megawatts, and based on the on-peak and off-peak power prices in SPP at the time, it generated about $10 million in energy revenue over the course of the month. In 2018, however, based on the decline in on-peak and off-peak power prices in SPP, and also the reduction in overall energy output from Harrington Unit 1 as a result of increased wind generation in SPP, that energy revenue now fell to $4.5 million for the month of December. Now, we also include the estimated cost for the 2 warm starts and the 3 hot starts that Harrington Unit 1 experienced over the course of the month, where that estimate comes out to be about $500,000 for just those 5 starts, and decreases the overall energy revenue to about $4 million. So therefore, the difference is just about $6 million between 2008 and 2018 for just the month of December for one coal unit. Next slide. Now talking about the current financial compensations and future possibilities. Again, independent system operators, or also called ISOs, have recognized the key or the integral part that coal-fired power plants play in maintaining this balanced power grid, and that these recent changes in the market, meaning increased renewable generation, increased natural gas generation, are forcing more and more of these coal-fired power plants into early retirements. 2 of the ISOs with the largest wind generation over the last years, this is ERCOT in Texas and SPP in the middle of the country, do not compensate their power plants for the capacity they provide. They're only referred to as energy-only markets. However, they have other energy revenue sources for emergency grid stability and voltage control and spinning reserve. However, these are compared to the energy revenue and compared to the capacity revenue that their coal-fired counterparts receive in, for example, PJM, are very minor. However, these other, or the 4 major ISOs, referring to PJM, MISO, SPP, and ERCOT, are all in the process of revising their current market structure and trying to figure out a way to appropriately compensate these coal plants for these new services that they're providing to the market without distorting or going too far away from the overall idea of these deregulated markets. In PJM, for example, PJM is discussing a price setting adjustment to minimize these losses for baseload coal-fired power plants overnight. Again, the big problem here is that with these low natural gas prices and increased renewable generation, overnight or off-peak power prices have fallen well below the operating costs or dispatch costs for these coal units. However, they need to stay, some of these coal units need to stay online at their maximum turn down levels to be available during on-peak or high-demand hours in the morning and to provide electricity during those times. So they're incurring significant losses overnight that they're now not able to make up during the day, and therefore incurring significant losses. So PJM is trying to adjust the price level that these power prices can fall to, or how these plants are being compensated that are needed to provide on-peak electricity for the very next day. MISO, on the other hand, is looking into providing a new market tool that provides load requirements up to 7 days out. They're calling it the multi-day operating margin forecast, and which allows these plant operators to decide on the scheduling of their generation fleet up to 7 days out with this forecast instead of going beyond the usual day ahead forecast. SPP and ERCOT, while not as detailed of an outline or the changes that they're proposing, like PJM and MISO, have also stated in their latest State of the Market reports the significance of coal-fired generation in their markets and how important this part of the generation fleet was to maintaining grid stability and providing electricity during high demand and or low renewable generation times. And so therefore they're exploring other price mechanisms that will compensate these power plants for the products that they're providing now to these markets. On the regulatory side, again, generally just to review, regulated utilities generally have two options to recover the cost for the operation of their generation fleet. Number one is they can recoup their incurred capital expenditures and investments in the generation fleet through rate cases every few years. Again, rate cases are generally backward looking and using projections for their capital costs going forward, and trying to true up the cost through every rate case, the cost that they have incurred during previous times. The second opportunity for regulated utilities to recoup some of their operating capital costs are through short-term rate adjustments that state utility commissions allow. Again, these are called very different things from state to state. For example, in Wyoming, it's called the annual power cost adjustment riders. In states like West Virginia and Kentucky, it's also called the fuel adjustment clause, to allow utilities to recoup some of these costs on a shorter time period in between rate cases. However, in these states where for these increased operating and maintenance costs, these can be recovered only on a going forward cost through these rate cases, and due to these unexpected changes or some of these changes in the electricity market that have happened at a much faster rate than originally anticipated, some of these utilities will likely have incurred some unexpected losses over this last decade. However, as more and more utility commissions are aware, retaining sufficient backup flexible capacity to ensure that reliable supply of electricity to their ratepayers during all times of the day, and provide this affordable and reliable electricity is paramount. And again, coal is one of the examples to provide this backup generation. As I've mentioned earlier, natural gas and emerging technologies like battery storage are also key players in providing this backup generation in times when more and more renewable generation is added to the mix. However, there are now discussions with climate change and on the horizon that utility commissions are now questioning when utilities are proposing to replace their aging coal fleet with new natural gas and incurring these additional CO2 emissions over the period, over the next 30 to 40 years that these new natural gas plants are expected to operate. Now, in conclusion, for the major takeaways, again, in summary, the issue is with natural gas and renewable generation ever increasing, coal generation decreasing, the operation of coal-fired power plants have changed significantly over the last decade. Again, the utilization rates for the average coal unit has declined significantly. It's operating at less efficient operating levels than it did just 10 years ago. It's incurring more, or it's incurring more and more cold starts, which increases the thermal fatigue and the stress on plant equipment and increases the overall operating and maintenance costs due to the lowered fuel efficiency during these starts and these ramp rates. And coal-fired units, especially in areas with high renewable generation, are experiencing higher load fluctuations or electric generating output, which again puts additional stress on these coal-fired units. Even though these coal units were not necessarily designed to be utilized as these load falling or even peaking generating resources, there exists different technologies that can aid these coal units in performing better with these changes in operations, especially with the affordable clean energy rule coming up with and compliance start there. There is a lot of opportunities for coal plant operators and owners to invest in their existing fleet to not only comply with the affordable clean energy rule, but also improve the overall flexibility and efficiency of their coal units to adjust to these changes in the market. Again, possible steps going forward. Again, starting at the very basics, an accurate assessment of the actual cycling costs for each coal unit is the very first step. And as I just said, investing in these existing coal-fired power plants to increase their flexibility and minimizing their own M costs with these changes in operation and making them more flexible and able to operate in a load-falling fashion is, in some regions, more economical than investing in new fossil generation. And again, the deregulated markets are in the process of adding new market mechanisms and products that appropriately compensate these coal plants for the reliability and flexibility that they provide. And regulated states and utility commissions are also investigating and assessing if the retirement of coal units are in the best interest of their ratepayers in providing reliable, flexible, and affordable electricity going forward. With that, I'm including the prepared slides and opening up for questions.
Thank you, Philip. Did everyone see that? I hope everyone saw the opportunity to ask questions. The way to do that, I'm going to turn it back over to Kira to see if we have any questions.
Thank you, Chairman Fornstrom. We do have a couple of questions from the audience, and everyone else can see the instructions on the slide. But a couple of questions for you, Philip, relating to slide 9. on the replacements for coal generation. There was a question on whether this analysis considered changes in imports or exports from resources in neighboring states, and also whether it included anything related to the impacts of distributed generation or behind-the-meter generation.
Thank you, Kara, for that question. Very good question. No, this particular analysis, or the data behind this chart only looks at the generation from in-state electric generating units, and these are on the grid or in front of the meter electricity generation. So this does not include distributed generation like rooftop solar, and it does not refer to changes in load. However, because this is on a generation mix percentage basis, any changes in load would be reflected in this particular chart.
Thank you. Chairman Fornstrom, did you have any questions?
I don't believe I do at this point. I was able to ask all my questions, I think, previously, so I don't have anything right now.
All right, I have a few more that came in from the audience. So the next question is, if least cost flexibility is a desirable outcome, would the consideration of load flexibility options be something to consider for, I think, either power producers or state regulators?
I'm sorry, Kira, can you repeat the question, please?
Yes, it was, if least cost flexibility is a desirable system outcome, would the consideration of load flexibility options like interruptible rates, thermal storage in electric hot water heaters, timing electric vehicle charging for wind and solar peak generation, would those be options to consider for state regulators and or power producers?
Yes, and Commissioner Fortson might have a few things to add on that too, but from my perspective, yes, absolutely. I think for state regulators, it's paramount to consider all the options that are available, and I think that's why white papers like these and others that NARUG is preparing to really educate state regulators on all the different options technology-wise for existing fossil fuel, but also new and emerging technologies that are out there, be it on the supply or demand side, are key to, again, ensure the affordable but also reliable supply of electricity to these ratepayers.
Thanks, Philip. So we have a question from the audience. I'm going to try to unmute Markham Watson. Go ahead.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, good. I did some number crunching with the EIA data on retail rates nationwide, just, the whole gamut, and found that, from 2008 to 2018, the rates have been pretty stable. In nominal terms, they went up about a penny. And after adjusting for CPI, they actually went down. And of course, during that same period, as you mentioned, the coal share went, plummeted, and natural gas's share went up, as did wind. And I'm wondering where the conclusion in the executive summary that states that providing essential market, compensating coal-fired generating units for providing essential market balancing attributes, could arguably result in lower electric retail rates. Where does that come from? Where does that, conclusion come from?
Thank you for that question, and I agree with you when you look on a national level that you've seen very little change in electric retail rates. Again, there are a lot of factors that go into the retail rate setting and the reason why, especially between 2008 and 2018, on a real dollar level, the change might have been very insignificant. Again, without going into too much more detail there, I think, and there have been enough reports out there to support that currently with the underestimation of the cost of coal-fired cycling costs, at times some of these coal plants are operating at higher costs than originally projected, and these costs are passed on to ratepayers in regulated states. And so by accurately assessing the true cost of cycling and to increase the optimization of dispatch of these coal units will ultimately lower the electric rates or the costs that are passed on to ratepayers, and as a result in decline in electricity rates to ratepayers. I hope that answer made sense. Yep.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks, Philip. We have another question from the audience. What is the best way to ensure that coal plants that may be needed for reliability and flexibility in the future, particularly in markets without capacity markets, do not retire? And maybe for this, you can talk through some of the mitigation strategies for plant operators that you referenced in the report.
Yes. So yeah, that is a very good question again, because this refers to specifically to ERCOT and SPP, the two major ISOs that do not have capacity markets and do not compensate their coal-fired generation for the capacity or reliability that they provide. Again, ERCOT's idea is that with an energy-only market, the increase in power price during very high demand times and or times when renewable generation is very, very low, these spikes in energy prices will provide enough financial compensation to the capacity that is online during those times to ensure their operation going forward. Again, just as an example, in ERCOT in 2019 in August, prices have spiked to the maximum level of $9,000 a megawatt hour for a few hours during a heat wave, and that provided quite a financial boost to these dispatchable generation that was online during that time when wind generation was relatively low compared to other hours and days before and after the heat wave, to ensure that this capacity will remain online going forward. Now, to your second question, to your second part, Kira, to what plant operators and plant owners can do specifically, this is, again, at the core of all of this is to improve the efficiency of these coal-fired power plants during their variability in electric output. Again, part of this includes the efficiency improvements that I've already talked about, flexible, variable frequency drives can increase the efficiency of these coal-fired units at lower operating levels. And again, the more accurate estimation of these increased operating costs for coal-fired power plants during these cycling times will increase the optimization that's available to plant operators to really operate their plants when it's cost effective for them to be online. Other things include operator coaching. We have other and training. There are specific other things to focus on now to during those maintenance outages to really improve the efficiency of these plants once they're back online.
Thanks, Philip. And we had another audience question on whether EVA considered the cost associated with individual state renewable mandates. And if so, what did it cost neighboring states that don't have those mandates but that share the grid across state lines? I assume exchange or import or export electricity across state lines. I think that may have been a little bit out of the scope of this direct paper, but did you have any comments on that?
Yes, I would agree that was a little bit outside the scope of this paper. Again, we focus specifically on the change in operating profile for coal-fired power plants in the United States and what we do on a unit-specific level, the cost changes. However, it's a very interesting question, and I think that's worth investigating in maybe future reports, how states or what impact these renewable energy portfolios have on the operation of coal-fired power plants or other dispatchable generation for that matter, and how these cost profiles on a state level are changing.
Thanks, Philip. And since we did receive this as a question, I just wanted to announce that we will be sharing the slides from this webinar. We'll send out to everyone who was registered later this afternoon. So I think that takes care of all of the questions that we received through the webinar. If we go to the final slide here and turn things back over to Chairman Fornstrom.
Thanks, Kira. You'll see on your slide a couple things that are coming up related to our subcommittee. First, the next white paper that the subcommittee's been working on will be released, and there's a webinar on that on February 6th, and it's on coal ash law and commercialization. Again, another really interesting report and a very timely topic for all of us to be thinking about. Then also at the winter meeting for NARUC, the staff subcommittee will meet on Sunday the 9th, and the subcommittee will meet on February 10th. We encourage all of you to participate in both of those opportunities. And then I also just want to give a plug. I mentioned earlier that one of the other things we do besides produce white papers is the site visit. This year we're going to do something a little bit different in April. We're having a Coal Futures Forum in Washington, D.C., April 21st to 23rd. We start at noon on Tuesday, the 21st, which allows folks to travel in that morning. And we conclude by noon on Thursday, again, to allow folks to travel home that afternoon. There is travel support through the generous cooperation we have with DOE. So I encourage all of you to participate in that. We'll be sending out more information on that soon. So also want to encourage people that are on the phone to join our subcommittee. We have both a staff and a commissioner committee, and we do a lot of work, and it's a lot of interesting topics right now. So I'd ask you to consider joining one of those organizations. So with that, I just want to thank Philip again for his great presentation, and of course Kira and Charles for their constant support of our subcommittee. Thanks to everyone for participating today.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon, and note that all the webinar materials will be posted on our website, www.naruc.org/CPI. So thanks everyone. Have a good afternoon.